The first-class cabin of Transcontinental Airways Flight 847 falls silent as a woman in an impeccable navy suit strides through the aircraft doors, her FAA credentials gleaming against her lapel. Director Angela Montgomery's eyes scan the cabin until they locate her target, a teenage girl pressed against the window seat. Tears streaming down her face while head flight attendant Bryce Whitman towers over her with obvious hostility. "Ma'am, you need to move to coach immediately," Whitman is saying, his voice dripping with condescension. "This section is for passengers who can actually afford to be here." The 17-year-old girl looks up, clutching her phone where she'd just ended a call. "I told you my ticket is legitimate. I can show you." "I don't want to see any more fake documents," Whitman interrupts, reaching for her arm. "Security is on their way." That's when Director Montgomery steps forward, her voice cutting through the cabin like steel. "Excuse me, but I believe you're harassing my daughter." Every head in first class turns as Whitman freezes mid-reach. The confident flight attendant, who had been so certain about removing the troublemaker, suddenly looks uncertain as he processes the federal credentials and commanding presence of the woman before him, Skylar. Montgomery looks up through her tears, relief flooding her features. "Mom, I tried to tell them my ticket was real, but they wouldn't listen." The realization hits Whitman like a freight train. The teenager he'd been publicly humiliating isn't just any passenger. She's the daughter of the director of the Federal Aviation Administration, the person who regulates his entire industry. 4 hours earlier, 17-year-old Skylar Montgomery sat in her bedroom in Arlington, Virginia, carefully packing for the most important trip of her young life. Her acceptance to the early admission program at Stanford University's Aerospace Engineering Department hung on tomorrow's interview, and she was both excited and nervous about flying alone to California. As the daughter of FAA Director Angela Montgomery and aerospace engineer Jackson Montgomery, Skylar had grown up surrounded by aviation. She could identify aircraft by their engine sounds, understood weather patterns that affected flight safety, and dreamed of designing the next generation of sustainable aircraft. This interview represented the first step toward making that dream reality. Her mother had insisted on booking her first-class ticket, not for luxury, but for practical reasons. "You'll have a quiet space to review your portfolio and prepare for the interview," Director Montgomery had explained. "Plus, I'll feel better knowing you're comfortable on such an important trip." Skylar had protested the expense, but her parents reminded her that this was an investment in her future. The first-class ticket also came with priority boarding, extra leg room for her 580 frame, and the ability to keep her presentation materials easily accessible during the flight. At Chicago O'Hare, Skylar navigated the airport with the confidence of someone who had grown up around aviation. She checked in smoothly, passed through security without issues, and arrived at gate C12 with time to spare. Her boarding pass clearly showed seat 2A, first class, with her name printed correctly. The gate agent, Lisa Hartwell, had processed hundreds of passengers that morning without incident. When she scanned Skylar's boarding pass, everything appeared normal. Valid ticket, proper seat assignment, no flags in the system. She smiled professionally and wished Skylar a pleasant flight. Skylar boarded during the first-class priority call, finding her seat without difficulty. She stowed her carry-on containing her Stanford portfolio, settled into the spacious seat, and pulled out her tablet to review her presentation one final time. She was dressed professionally in a navy blazer and khakis, looking every inch the serious student she was. Other first-class passengers filed in around her, business travelers in expensive suits, an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, a few families with young children. Everyone seemed to belong in the premium cabin except, apparently, to the flight crew, who would soon make that judgment based solely on her appearance. Flight 847 was operated by a crew that prided itself on maintaining standards in the first-class cabin. Head flight attendant Bryce Whitman had 15 years of experience and strong opinions about who deserved premium service. To him, first class represented exclusivity that should be protected from what he considered inappropriate passengers. As Skylar settled in for the 4-hour flight to Los Angeles, she had no way of knowing that her race, age, and solo travel status would soon trigger assumptions that would transform a routine flight into a public humiliation. She was simply a brilliant teenager pursuing her dreams, unaware that others would try to limit those dreams based on prejudice rather than merit. The airplane pushed back from the gate on time, with Skylar focused on her future rather than the discrimination she was about to face at 35,000 feet. 20 minutes into Flight 847's journey to Los Angeles, head flight attendant Bryce Whitman began his routine first-class service check. He prided himself on maintaining what he called appropriate standards in the premium cabin, which often meant scrutinizing passengers who didn't fit his narrow definition of first-class travelers. When his eyes fell on Skylar, sitting quietly in Seat 2A while reviewing her Stanford portfolio, his expression shifted to suspicion. A black teenager traveling alone in first class triggered every prejudiced assumption he had developed over 15 years of airline service. "Excuse me, Miss," Whitman said, approaching her seat with obvious skepticism. "I need to see your boarding pass and identification." Skylar looked up from her tablet, confused by the request. "Is there a problem? I showed my boarding pass when I got on the plane. I need to verify that you're in the correct seat," Whitman replied, though he had made no similar requests of other passengers. Skylar handed over her boarding pass and driver's license, both clearly showing her name and seat assignment. Whitman studied them with exaggerated scrutiny, as if searching for evidence of fraud. "This doesn't look right," he announced loudly, drawing attention from other passengers. "First-class tickets are very expensive. Are you sure you didn't make a mistake during check-in?" The accusation stung, but Skylar maintained her composure. "Sir, my mother booked the ticket. Everything is correct. I'm traveling to Los Angeles for a college interview at Stanford." Whitman's skeptical expression deepened. "Stanford? And your mother just happened to buy you a first-class ticket? That seems unlikely." Flight attendant Paige Thornton joined the conversation, drawn by the commotion. "Bryce, what's the issue here? This passenger claims she belongs in first class, but something doesn't add up," Whitman explained, speaking as if Skylar weren't present. "Look at her. Does she look like she can afford a $2,000 ticket?" The casual racism in his assessment was obvious to other passengers, several of whom began paying uncomfortable attention to the developing situation. Dr. Amelia Brooks, a physician in Seat 1C, frowned as she recognized the discriminatory nature of the interrogation. Skylar felt heat rising in her cheeks as she realized the crew was questioning her presence based solely on her race and age. "Sir, I can call my mother if you need verification. She works for the government and handles travel arrangements regularly." This offer seemed to amuse both flight attendants. "Oh, your mother works for the government," Thornton said with barely concealed sarcasm. "Let me guess, she's some kind of executive who can afford first-class tickets for teenagers." "Actually, yes," Skylar replied truthfully, though she could see they weren't taking her seriously. "She's the director of the Federal Aviation Administration." Whitman laughed openly at this claim. "Right, and I suppose your father is the Secretary of Transportation. Young lady, making up stories isn't going to help your situation." Business traveler Robert Chen, seated across the aisle, quietly began recording the interaction on his phone. As a frequent flyer, he had witnessed discrimination before, but rarely so blatantly displayed by airline crew members. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and move to coach," Whitman announced, his voice carrying throughout the first-class cabin. "This ticket was obviously obtained improperly, and we cannot allow you to remain in a seat you haven't paid for." Skylar's voice trembled as she realized the situation was spiraling beyond her control. "Sir, please just call my mother. Her name is Angela Montgomery, and she's the FAA director. This ticket is legitimate." But Whitman and Thornton had already decided their version of events, and no amount of truth from a black teenager was going to change their minds. The systematic humiliation was just beginning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The confrontation in the first-class cabin intensified as head flight attendant Bryce Whitman grew more aggressive in his demands for Skylar to move to coach. His certainty that she didn't belong in premium seating had solidified into a public spectacle that other passengers watched with growing discomfort. "Miss, I've been patient with you, but this has gone on long enough," Whitman declared loudly. "First-class service is for paying customers, not for people trying to scam their way into better seats." Skylar remained in her assigned seat, her boarding pass and ID clearly proving her legitimate ticket purchase. "Sir, I've shown you my documentation. Everything is in order. Why won't you accept that I belong here?" Flight attendant Chad Remington joined his colleagues, creating an intimidating presence around Skylar's seat. "Bryce, what's the situation with this passenger? Claims she has a legitimate first-class ticket, but obviously someone made an error during check-in," Whitman explained. "She's been disruptive and refuses to move to her proper seat in coach." The accusation of being disruptive was particularly galling since Skylar had done nothing but sit quietly and study her. Materials. Dr. Brooks, the physician witness, shook her head at the obvious falsehood. "I haven't been disruptive," Skylar said firmly. "I've been sitting here reviewing my college interview materials. The only disruption has been your continued questioning of my legitimately purchased ticket." Remington studied her with obvious skepticism. "Look, kid, first-class tickets cost more than most people make in a week. Your story about Stanford and government jobs just doesn't add up." The casual dismissal of her achievements and family background reflected assumptions that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with prejudice. Skylar realized she was facing a systematic form of discrimination that logic alone couldn't overcome. "Would you like me to call Stanford to verify my interview appointment?" she offered desperately. "Or perhaps you could contact Transcontinental's customer service to confirm my ticket purchase." Whitman scoffed at both suggestions. "We don't have time to chase down elaborate stories. Other passengers are waiting for service. And you're creating a disturbance." Purser Amanda Kelly approached from the galley, having been summoned to deal with what the crew characterized as a difficult passenger situation. At 39, she had significant authority over cabin operations and could make final decisions about passenger removal. "What seems to be the problem here?" Kelly asked, though her tone suggested she had already been briefed by her colleagues. "Passenger refuses to move to coach where she belongs," Whitman summarized. "Claims she has a legitimate first-class ticket, but you can see for yourself that doesn't make sense." Kelly looked at Skylar with the same skeptical expression her crew members had displayed. The teenager's race, age, and solo travel status had created a presumption of guilt that no amount of documentation seemed capable of overcoming. "Miss, I'm going to need you to cooperate with my crew," Kelly said authoritatively. "If there's been a mistake with your seating assignment, we can sort it out after we land. For now, please gather your belongings and move to coach." The demand was presented as reasonable, but it was based entirely on discriminatory assumptions rather than any actual evidence of ticketing problems. Skylar realized she was trapped in a situation where her word meant nothing against the crew's prejudiced conclusions. "Ma'am, with respect, I'm not moving from my legitimately assigned seat," Skylar said with as much dignity as she could muster. "If you believe there's been an error, please contact your supervisor or check with the gate agent who processed my boarding." This reasonable request seemed to frustrate the crew further. They had expected compliance, not logical resistance, from someone they had already dismissed as unworthy of first-class service. "That's it," Whitman announced. "I'm calling the captain and having security meet the aircraft. This passenger is being disruptive and refusing to follow crew instructions." While Skylar faced escalating harassment at 35,000 feet, FAA Director Angela Montgomery was concluding a high-stakes meeting with airline executives at the Department of Transportation headquarters in Washington, D.C. The session focused on new safety regulations that would significantly impact airline operations and profitability. Director Montgomery, at 49, commanded respect throughout the aviation industry. Her rise to the top of the Federal Aviation Administration had come through decades of expertise in aerospace policy, aviation safety, and regulatory enforcement. Airlines knew better than to cross her, as she wielded enormous power over their operations, routes, and safety certifications. The new fatigue management rules will be implemented across all carriers by the end of the fiscal year, she informed the assembled airline presidents. Non-compliance will result in immediate grounding of affected aircraft and crew members. Among the executives present was Transcontinental Airways CEO Patricia Lawson, who had been fighting the proposed regulations due to their projected impact on operational costs. She sat quietly as Director Montgomery outlined enforcement mechanisms that could devastate airlines that failed to comply. Director Montgomery, Lawson ventured, perhaps we could discuss implementation timelines that better accommodate operational realities. Montgomery's response was measured but firm. Ms. Lawson, passenger safety is not negotiable. Airlines that cannot adapt to safety requirements will find their operating certificates under review. The implicit threat carried significant weight. The FAA director had the authority to ground entire fleets, revoke airline certifications, and impose fines that could bankrupt non-compliant carriers. Her reputation for holding airlines accountable was well established throughout the industry. As the meeting concluded, Montgomery checked her phone and noticed a missed call from Skylar. Her daughter was scheduled to land in Los Angeles in 2 hours, and the FAA director made a mental note to call her after the aircraft arrived. Meanwhile, Deputy Administrator Colin Richardson was monitoring real-time flight tracking systems that showed Flight 847 proceeding normally toward Los Angeles. As a former airline pilot himself, Richardson understood the operational complexities of commercial aviation and often served as a liaison between the FAA and airline management. What neither Montgomery nor Richardson knew was that high, above the western United States, Skylar was experiencing the exact type of discrimination that federal regulations were designed to prevent. The irony was profound. While her mother crafted policies to ensure fair treatment of airline passengers, Skylar was being subjected to systematic harassment by crew members who had no idea they were targeting the FAA director's daughter. Chief Inspector Melody Watson, responsible for investigating airline safety and compliance violations, was reviewing passenger complaint data when her assistant noted an unusual pattern of discrimination complaints against Transcontinental Airways. The airline had received 17 formal complaints in the past 6 months, all involving allegations of racial profiling and discriminatory treatment. We should flag this for further investigation, Watson told her team. Pattern discrimination suggests systematic problems that require federal intervention. The conversation was taking place just as Skylar's harassment was reaching its peak. Though the federal investigators had no way of knowing that their colleague's daughter was experiencing firsthand the type of discrimination they were tasked with preventing. Business traveler Robert Chen, still recording the confrontation discreetly, had extensive connections throughout the aviation industry due to his work as an aerospace consultant. He recognized the professional manner in which Skylar handled herself and began to suspect there was more to her story than the crew was willing to acknowledge. Dr. Amelia Brooks, the physician witnessing the harassment, had served on several FAA medical advisory committees and knew Director Montgomery personally. She was beginning to recognize something familiar about Skylar's bearing and professional demeanor. Though she couldn't immediately place the connection, the convergence of federal oversight, industry monitoring, and witness documentation was creating a perfect storm that would soon engulf the crew members who thought they could discriminate against a teenager without consequences. Captain Roger Sullivan, commanding Flight 847 from the cockpit, received Whitman's request to have security meet the aircraft with growing concern. In his 26 years of airline service, he had learned to question crew reports that seemed disproportionate to describe passenger behavior. "Bryce, explain to me exactly what this passenger has done that requires security intervention," Sullivan requested through the intercom. Whitman's response was telling in what it omitted. "She's refusing to move from first class to her proper seat in coach, Captain. She's been disruptive and uncooperative with crew instructions." Sullivan asked the crucial follow-up question. "Have you verified her ticket and seat assignment through our passenger manifest system?" There was a notable pause before Whitman replied, "Sir, it's obvious from looking at her that there's been some kind of mistake." Captain Sullivan's expression hardened. After decades in aviation, he recognized coded language for discrimination. "Bryce, I want you to physically check the passenger manifest system right now and confirm her seat assignment." First Officer Jamie Peterson, monitoring the conversation, pulled up the digital passenger list on her tablet. "Captain, I show Angela Montgomery, seat 2A first class, ticket purchased 3 days ago with confirmed payment." The electronic record contradicted everything Whitman had reported. There was no ticketing error, no seating mistake, no legitimacy questions about Schuyler's presence in first class. "Bryce," Sullivan said sharply, "return to the cabin immediately and resolve this situation professionally. This passenger has a confirmed first-class ticket and should be treated accordingly, but Whitman had invested too much credibility in his discriminatory narrative to back down gracefully. Instead of apologizing to Schuyler, he doubled down on his position. "Captain, with respect, I believe this passenger may have obtained her ticket fraudulently. The circumstances just don't add up." Sullivan had heard enough. "First Officer Peterson, please contact LAX operations and request that an FAA inspector meet our aircraft upon arrival. We have a potential crew misconduct situation that requires federal review. The captain's decision to involve federal authorities rather than local security represented a critical turning point. Instead of supporting his crew's discrimination, he was treating it as a regulatory violation that required federal oversight." Dr. Brooks, who had been listening to the escalating confrontation, finally placed where she recognized Schuyler from a photo in Director Montgomery's office during an FAA medical advisory meeting. 6 months earlier, she quietly activated her phone and placed a call to a number she had memorized from her federal consulting. "Work. Director Montgomery's office? This is Deputy Administrator Richardson. Colin, this is Dr. Amelia Brooks. I'm on Transcontinental Flight 847, and I believe Director Montgomery's daughter is being discriminated against by the flight crew. She's been trying to tell them who her mother is, but they won't listen." Richardson immediately understood the implications. "Dr. Brooks, can you put me on speaker so the crew can hear this conversation?" Brooks approached Purser Kelly, who was still pressuring Schuyler to move to coach. "Excuse me, I have Deputy Administrator Richardson from the FAA on the phone. He'd like to speak with your crew chief." The mention of the FAA Deputy Administrator sent shockwaves through the cabin crew. Kelly reluctantly took the phone, her confidence evaporating as she realized federal authorities were now involved. "This is Purser Kelly. How can I help you, sir?" Richardson's voice carried unmistakable authority. "Ms. Kelly, you have the daughter of FAA Director Angela Montgomery on your aircraft. She is legitimately ticketed in first class, and I understand she's being harassed by your crew. This situation needs to be resolved immediately and professionally." The revelation hit the crew like a lightning bolt. The teenager they had been humiliating for the past hour was the daughter of the most powerful person in American aviation, someone who could end their careers with a single phone call. The first-class cabin of Flight 847 underwent a dramatic transformation as the reality of Schuyler's identity sank in among the crew members. Head flight attendant Bryce Whitman, who had been so confident in his discriminatory assumptions, now faced the horrifying realization that he had been harassing the daughter of his industry's most powerful regulator. Purser Amanda Kelly's hands trembled as she held Dr. Brooks' phone, listening to Deputy Administrator Richardson's authoritative voice explain exactly who they had been mistreating for the past hour. Furthermore, Richardson continued, Director Montgomery is currently en route to Los Angeles and will be meeting the aircraft upon arrival. I suggest you use the remaining flight time to consider how you're going to explain your crew's conduct to someone who has the authority to revoke Transcontinental's operating certificates. The threat was not subtle, nor was it empty. The FAA director possessed extraordinary power over airline operations, from individual crew certifications to entire company authorizations. A discrimination incident involving her own daughter would trigger consequences that could reshape Transcontinental Airways permanently. Captain Sullivan, monitoring the situation from the cockpit, made an announcement over the passenger address system. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for any disturbance in the cabin. Our crew is resolving a service issue and ensuring all passengers receive the professional treatment they deserve. The carefully worded apology was directed primarily at Schuyler, though it also served notice to other passengers that the airline recognized something had gone seriously wrong with crew conduct. Whitman approached Schuyler's seat with an expression of panic, barely concealed behind forced professionalism. Miss Montgomery, I want to apologize for any misunderstanding. Can I bring you a beverage or make you more comfortable for the remainder of the flight? The abrupt reversal from harassment to obsequious service was jarring. Schuyler, emotionally drained from an hour of discrimination and humiliation, responded with remarkable grace for a 17-year-old who had been publicly degraded. Mr. Whitman, what I would like is an explanation for why you assumed I didn't belong in first class, based on my appearance rather than checking my legitimate documentation. The question cut to the heart of the discrimination she had experienced, and Whitman struggled to formulate a response that didn't acknowledge his obvious racial profiling. Flight attendant Paige Thornton, realizing her career was likely over, attempted damage control. Miss Montgomery, we were just following standard procedures for verifying passenger seating assignments. Robert Chen, who had recorded much of the harassment, spoke up from his seat across the aisle. I've been flying first class for 15 years, and I've never once been asked to verify my ticket after boarding. What you did to this young lady was obviously discriminatory. His intervention carried weight as a witness and frequent flyer, making it impossible for the crew to maintain their fiction about standard procedures. Dr. Brooks returned to her seat after ending the call with Richardson, but not before addressing the crew directly. I've known Director Montgomery professionally for several years. She's not someone who tolerates discrimination in any form, particularly when it targets young people pursuing their education. The physician's words carried an ominous undertone that suggested the crew's troubles were just beginning. Airlines depended on maintaining positive relationships with federal regulators, and antagonizing the FAA director through discriminatory treatment of her daughter was potentially catastrophic. Chad Remington, the flight attendant who had joined the harassment, quietly retreated to the galley to begin updating his resume. He recognized that federal scrutiny of the incident would likely end his aviation career, particularly given the recorded evidence of his participation in the discrimination. As Flight 847 continued toward Los Angeles, the power dynamic in first class had completely reversed. The crew members who had felt so confident in their authority to harass and humiliate a black teenager now understood they faced professional and legal consequences that could destroy their careers and potentially result in federal criminal charges. Schuyler, no longer the victim of systematic harassment, found herself in the surreal position of being treated with exaggerated deference by the same people who had spent an hour trying to remove her from her legitimately Assigned seat. The remaining flight time would be spent in tense anticipation of Director Montgomery's arrival at LAX, where the crew would face the consequences of their assumption that a black teenager couldn't possibly belong in first class. Director Angela Montgomery's arrival at Los Angeles International Airport triggered an unprecedented federal response to airline discrimination. Within hours of Flight 847's landing, FAA investigators, Civil Rights Division attorneys, and Department of Transportation officials converged on LAX to document what would become a landmark case of systematic airline discrimination. The crew's harassment of Schuyler was just the beginning of a comprehensive investigation that exposed widespread discriminatory practices throughout Transcontinental Airways. Federal investigators discovered training materials that included coded language encouraging crew members to scrutinize passengers who didn't fit traditional first class demographics. Head flight attendant Bryce Whitman faced immediate suspension and federal civil rights charges. The recorded evidence of his discriminatory conduct, combined with testimony from multiple witnesses, created an ironclad case for prosecution under federal hate crime statutes that carried potential prison sentences. Mr. Whitman's conduct toward Director Montgomery's daughter was not an isolated incident, explained Civil Rights Division prosecutor Nicole Sterling. Our investigation has uncovered a pattern of discriminatory behavior that suggests systematic training and encouragement of racial profiling. The financial consequences for Transcontinental Airways were devastating. The Department of Transportation imposed a $2.8 million fine for civil rights violations, while the FAA initiated compliance reviews of all operational procedures, crew training programs, and customer service protocols. CEO Patricia Lawson, who had been fighting Director Montgomery's safety regulations just hours before the incident, now found herself implementing comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all 15,000 transcontinental employees. The airline's stock price plummeted 12% in the first week following news of the federal investigation. Captain Roger Sullivan, whose professional handling of the situation had prevented further escalation, was commended by federal investigators and became a model for how airline captains should respond to crew misconduct. His decision to involve FAA oversight rather than supporting discriminatory crew behavior demonstrated proper leadership under pressure. Flight attendant Paige Thornton received a formal reprimand and mandatory retraining, but avoided criminal charges in exchange for her cooperation with federal investigators. Her testimony revealed how discriminatory attitudes were reinforced through informal crew communications and supervisory approval of questionable passenger challenges. The systematic investigation extended beyond individual crew members to examine airline policies, training materials, and corporate culture that enabled discrimination to flourish. Federal auditors found evidence that passenger complaints about discriminatory treatment had been systematically dismissed or minimized by airline management. Dr. Amelia Brooks's intervention and professional connections had been crucial in preventing further escalation of Schuyler's harassment. Her quick thinking in contacting Deputy Administrator Richardson demonstrated how professional networks could be leveraged to protect victims of discrimination when institutional responses failed. Robert Chen's recorded documentation of the harassment became crucial evidence in multiple federal prosecutions. His video footage was used in congressional hearings on airline discrimination and became part of mandatory training programs for airline crew members nationwide. Inspector General Marcus Blackwood's investigation revealed that Transcontinental's discriminatory practices had cost the airline significant revenue through negative publicity, federal fines, and operational disruptions. The financial argument against discrimination proved as compelling as the moral and legal arguments. Senator Patricia Lawson, chair of the Transportation Committee, announced congressional hearings on airline discrimination practices with Director Montgomery as the lead witness. The hearings would result in new federal legislation, strengthening protections for airline passengers and increasing penalties for discriminatory conduct. Most significantly, the incident catalyzed industry-wide changes in crew training, passenger service protocols, and corporate accountability measures. Airlines across the country implemented new policies specifically designed to prevent the type of discrimination Schuyler had experienced. The Transcontinental incident became a case study in business schools and law schools, demonstrating how discriminatory practices could destroy corporate reputations, trigger federal intervention, and result in millions of dollars in financial penalties. For the aviation industry, Schuyler's experience represented a watershed moment that forced long overdue conversations about unconscious bias, systematic discrimination, and the importance of treating all passengers with dignity regardless of their appearance or perceived social status. 6 months after the Flight 847 incident, Angela Montgomery stood before a packed auditorium at Stanford University. The lights were hot and unforgiving, yet she didn't flinch. She gripped the podium with steady hands, her voice clear and measured as she looked out at the hundreds of faces waiting for her to speak. Students, faculty, aviation professionals, even reporters filled the hall. For many of them, this was the first time seeing the young woman whose name had dominated headlines, the passenger who had turned humiliation in the skies into a movement for justice on the ground. That day on the airplane, Schuyler began, her gaze sweeping the room. I learned that having the right documentation isn't always enough. Sometimes you need allies who will speak up when systems fail, and institutions willing to hold people accountable when they discriminate. Her words landed heavily, and the audience leaned forward. The story was already familiar to them, how she had been profiled and harassed by airline crew despite carrying valid tickets and identification, but hearing it directly from her added a rawness that no article or television clip could capture. Few in the room knew that just hours after enduring the ordeal, she had walked into her Stanford admissions interview, determined not to let prejudice define her. She had sat across from a panel of professors, her posture straight, her voice calm, her answers precise. When they asked about her career goals in aerospace engineering, she spoke passionately about propulsion systems and sustainable aviation fuels. What the committee had noticed most, however, was her composure under extraordinary pressure. They saw not just a gifted student, but a resilient leader, someone who could thrive in both the lab and the world beyond it. Her acceptance letter had arrived weeks later, and for Schuyler, it wasn't just an academic achievement. It was proof that dignity could survive even the worst attempts to strip it away. The airline crew who had tried to break her dignity did not escape consequences. Bryce Whitman, the senior flight attendant whose words had cut the deepest, found himself in federal court, charged with civil rights violations under color of authority. The jury deliberated only 3 hours before convicting him. 2 years in federal prison was the sentence, a punishment that made headlines nationwide and sent a message to airline employees everywhere. Abuse of authority against passengers would no longer be tolerated as a minor infraction. Chad Remington and Paige Thornton, who had stood by and joined in the profiling, faced their own reckoning. Federal investigators uncovered evidence that they had participated in systematic passenger harassment, dismissing complaints with mockery or intimidation. Neither saw the inside of a prison cell, but both were permanently banned from commercial aviation. Their names appeared in training materials across the industry as examples of what not to become. For Transcontinental Airways, the airline at the center of the scandal, the fallout was catastrophic at first. Passenger trust evaporated, stocks plummeted, and lawsuits piled up. But under the direction of newly appointed CEO Marcus Blackwood, the company chose reform over collapse. Blackwood addressed shareholders in a somber tone, admitting failures and outlining a sweeping plan to rebuild. What happened to Angela Montgomery should never happen to any passenger, he said. We've implemented reforms to ensure that from this day forward, every passenger will be treated with respect and professionalism, regardless of their appearance or background. Mandatory anti-discrimination workshops were rolled out for every employee. A passenger dignity board was created, composed of community leaders, civil rights advocates, and passenger representatives who reviewed complaints independently of airline management. Transcontinental transformed from a symbol of failure into a leader in reform, and other airlines soon followed its example, unwilling to risk becoming the next cautionary tale. Meanwhile, Schuyler's mother, Director Montgomery, brought the fight to Capitol Hill. Standing before a congressional committee, she told lawmakers in plain, resolute words why federal protections had to extend more forcefully into aviation. "My daughter's experience reminded me why we have civil rights laws," she declared. "Oversight exists to protect citizens when local systems fail. That protection must extend to commercial aviation, because without it, passengers are left defenseless at 30,000 feet." Her testimony carried weight. Within months, Congress passed the Airline Passenger Dignity Act, which introduced new enforcement mechanisms and imposed harsher penalties on discriminatory conduct. Airlines were now required to publish quarterly reports on passenger discrimination complaints, creating a level of transparency that had never existed before. Others from that flight also became unlikely heroes. Dr. Amelia Brooks, the physician who had intervened on Schuyler's behalf, received the FAA's highest civilian honor. Her steady, courageous intervention had prevented the situation from escalating further, and she used her newfound recognition to advocate for bystander intervention training. Robert Chen, the quiet passenger who had filmed the incident, saw his video reach more than 5 million viewers. He found himself invited to conferences, his footage now a key resource in civil rights education. And then there was Captain Sullivan. His decision to override crew solidarity and prioritize Schuyler's rights had been risky in the moment, but it became the defining act of his career. Promoted to chief pilot, he now trained young captains on leadership under pressure, teaching them that true command meant protecting those in your care, even from your own team. The ripple effects spread far beyond aviation. Hotels, restaurants, retail chains, even ride-sharing companies began examining their practices. Discrimination, once considered a murky grey area of customer service, was now a glaring legal liability. Many adopted new training programs modeled after the aviation industry's reforms, recognizing that appearance-based bias was not just morally indefensible, but financially disastrous. For Schuyler, the personal journey had only just begun. She used her platform to create a scholarship foundation for minority students, pursuing careers in aerospace engineering. To her, the future of aviation wasn't just safer flights. It was a more inclusive industry, where those designing the planes represented the diversity of the passengers inside them. "I never wanted to become a symbol," she admitted during a late-night television interview. "But if my experience prevents other young people from facing the same discrimination, then the humiliation was worth it." Letters began pouring in from students across the country, high schoolers, undergraduates, even young professionals, who told her how much her courage meant to them. Some wrote of the strength they found in her story, others of the hope that her scholarship program offered. Schuyler read each one carefully, often moved to tears. The girl who had once been told she didn't belong in first class now stood as proof that no seat, no institution, no field of study was off limits. Her scars had not silenced her. They had sharpened her voice, given it power. As she stepped off the stage at Stanford that night, the standing ovation that rose to meet her was deafening. Students shouted her name. Professors clapped until their hands ached, and aviation leaders exchanged quiet nods. They weren't applauding a victim. They were applauding a young woman who had turned injustice into transformation, humiliation into dignity, and one ugly incident into a nationwide movement for change. And for Schuyler, it was only the beginning. 2 years after the Flight 847 discrimination incident, Los Angeles International Airport dedicated the Angela and Skylar Montgomery Passenger Rights Center, a facility designed to investigate and resolve airline discrimination complaints in real time. The center represented a permanent commitment to ensuring that no passenger would face the harassment Skylar had experienced. Director Angela Montgomery, now in her final year as FAA administrator before accepting a position as Dean of Aerospace Engineering at MIT, reflected on how her daughter's ordeal had catalyzed industry-wide transformation. What began as a personal nightmare became an opportunity to create systematic change that protects all airline passengers, she explained during the dedication ceremony. Skylar's courage in facing discrimination with dignity inspired reforms that will benefit travelers for generations. The legal precedents established by the federal prosecution of Flight 847's crew had been upheld by the Supreme Court, creating permanent protections against airline discrimination and establishing enhanced penalties for transportation industry civil rights violations. Bryce Whitman, completing his federal sentence, had become an unlikely advocate for anti-discrimination training after his prison experience opened his eyes to the consequences of prejudice. His testimony before parole boards was used to demonstrate how unconscious bias could destroy careers and lives. Transcontinental Airways had evolved into the industry leader in passenger rights and diversity initiatives. Under CEO Blackwood's leadership, the airline achieved the highest customer satisfaction ratings in the industry while maintaining profitability through operational excellence rather than discriminatory cost-cutting. The Montgomery incident taught us that treating all passengers with respect isn't just morally correct. It's good business, Blackwood explained to aviation industry leaders. Discrimination is expensive, destructive, and ultimately self-defeating. Stanford University's Skylar Montgomery Institute for Transportation Equity had become the nation's premier research center for studying and preventing discrimination in transportation systems. The institute's work influenced policy development worldwide and trained the next generation of transportation professionals. Dr. Amelia Brooks, now serving as the institute's medical ethics director, continued her work, ensuring that professional intervention training became standard practice across multiple industries. Her model of effective bystander intervention had been adopted by organizations worldwide. Robert Chen's documentation expertise had evolved into a non-profit organization that trained citizens to safely record and report discrimination incidents. His work helped create digital evidence that supported hundreds of successful civil rights prosecutions. The congressional hearings prompted by Skylar's experience had resulted in the most comprehensive transportation civil rights legislation in decades. The Airline Passenger Dignity Act created enforcement mechanisms that made discrimination financially devastating for airlines while providing victims with meaningful recourse. Senator Lawson, now chair of the Commerce Committee, used her platform to ensure transportation equity remained a federal priority. The Montgomery case proved that individual courage combined with institutional accountability can create lasting change, she noted. Captain Sullivan, now Chief of Flight Operations for Transcontinental, had developed leadership training programs that taught aviation professionals how to recognize and address discrimination before it escalated. His approach became the industry standard for handling crew misconduct. For Skylar herself, now a junior at Stanford studying aerospace engineering with a focus on sustainable aviation systems, the discrimination incident had become a defining moment that shaped her commitment to creating inclusive transportation systems. That day on the airplane taught me that progress requires both individual courage and institutional commitment, she told aerospace engineering students during her commencement address. Change happens when people refuse to accept injustice and when institutions have the integrity to hold wrongdoers accountable. The scholarship program Schuyler established with her legal settlement had provided full college funding for 127 students from underrepresented communities, pursuing careers in aerospace, aviation, and transportation engineering. Many of these students were now working at NASA, Boeing, Airbus, and other industry leaders, gradually transforming the demographics of aviation. The Montgomery case had international implications as well. The International Civil Aviation Organization adopted new standards for passenger rights and anti-discrimination training based on reforms implemented in the United States following Schuyler's experience. Airlines worldwide now displayed passenger rights information in multiple languages, provided clear complaint procedures, and maintained zero-tolerance policies for discriminatory conduct by crew members. The changes represented a fundamental shift in how the aviation industry approached customer service and civil rights. As the dedication ceremony concluded, Director Montgomery and Schuyler walked through LAX's terminals, observing the diverse mix of passengers being treated with uniform professionalism by airline personnel. The transformation was visible in everything from crew interactions to passenger service protocols. "You know," Director Montgomery said to her daughter, "what happened to you that day was terrible. But watching how you've used that experience to protect others, that's what I'm most proud of, as your mother." Schuyler smiled, adjusting the aerospace engineering pin on her jacket lapel. "The crew thought they were putting me in my place. Instead, they helped me find my purpose. The teenager who had been told she didn't belong in first. Class had grown into a young woman, dedicated to ensuring that everyone belonged wherever their dreams and hard work could take them. Her legacy lived on in every passenger treated with dignity, every discrimination complaint taken seriously, and every young person who pursued aviation careers, knowing they would be welcomed and respected." The Flight 847 incident had ended, but its impact would continue for generations, a testament to how individual courage, when supported by institutional accountability, could transform entire industries and protect countless people from injustice. The memorial at LAX would serve as a permanent reminder that progress in civil rights required constant vigilance, but that such vigilance could create lasting change that made society more just for everyone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.